So this panel is really going to focus on, so if you don't know these folks, you're going to in a couple of minutes, but these are some of the best security and privacy related journalists that I have worked with in my career. And I invited them to Enigma this year because we wanted to have a conversation about how cybercrime and other types of like security incidents and things get covered, kind of like the behind the scenes of like, how does this happen from like the newsroom perspective? How do reporters think about how to cover certain things? And so I'm also like this is terrible, but I am a true crime podcast addict. So I was like, how can I bring true crime to Enigma? And so this is the incantation of that. So I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves, and then we will start the discussion. Please post questions in Slack if you have them. We'll ask those at the end, or of course you can use the mics in the room as well. But very rarely will you get the opportunity to ask these folks questions because you all work for companies with PR teams, except for Leah, who's at Fun Employed at the moment. Yeah. So please make use of this opportunity. So we'll start on my left and then move to the end.
Cool. Hi, I'm Alfred. I'm a privacy reporter at Politico. Prior to that, I was also a privacy reporter at The Markup, and I covered cybersecurity and privacy for CNET from 2016 to 2020, before we were replaced by AI. So.
Or you are AI right now in front of us. I'm Lily Hay-Newman. I'm a security and privacy reporter at Wired, and I used to be a general interest tech reporter at Slate. And yeah, I have not yet been replaced by AI to my knowledge.
I'm Joe Menn. I started covering tech security in 1999, and I'm now at the Washington Post. I had stints at the LA Times and the Financial Times, and then Reuters. You know, sometimes I write books. So I did one about the Russian government being in cahoots with organized cybercrime called Fatal System Error. And then more recently I wrote a book called Cult of the Dead Cow.
Awesome. So I want to start off just with a little bit of context for everybody, because you've all kind of covered cybercrime in a little bit of a different way in terms of the different players and perspectives, and the lens that even if you're covering the same incident, you were looking at it from different vantage points because you're focusing on different like stakeholders within that scenario. So I want to ask, how do you decide which perspective to cover, right? Whether it's like victims, the attackers, the investigators, and can you ever cover them all within the same story?
Yeah, so a lot of my coverage was very much focused on victims of cybercrime. So ransomware was a big deal. I think it still is, but it was, you know, really creeping up around the time that I was covering cybersecurity. So I was reaching out to schools. I was reaching out to, you know, folks at hospitals about how is this impacting you. I think for me that was just more important, and I think it mattered a lot more for our audiences. Because CNET was like a very like general news tech website, so it made a lot more sense for me to show the harms of cybercrime more than, you know, how did this like attack happen, or what vulnerability did they get in on. I think it was more valuable for our readers to show, you know, here's the impact of like these kinds of attacks.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, especially like, can you do it all in one story? I would say similarly, Wired, we often attempt to really focus on victims, but it can be really hard, right? Like victims, this is, you know, something we know about cybercrime and just sort of security incidents in general, or security findings in general, vulnerability findings, all types of disclosure. Like people don't want to talk about it and come forward, and they don't want to be on the record. So anytime they can avoid that, they do. So that actually makes it challenging. I think sometimes it can feel like, well, the perspective of victims and the real human toll of some of these things isn't being told enough or isn't being heard enough, but there is a tension there where it can be really hard to get that stuff on the record. But yeah, that's a huge focus for us. But then I think a lot of other perspectives, like Wired is always trying to cover kind of the interesting technical nuances as well of how things happen and the sequence of events. So maybe that brings in a bunch of the different perspectives, but it's pretty hard to hit everything in one story, especially like a tight news story.
My hidden agenda is to try to educate people about important, complicated stuff and write it in plain words that regular folks would actually care about and see why it's important. And by regular folks, I'm including members of Congress, most of whom do not have engineering degrees, though that's improving. The Holy Grail, though, is a story where you can do the whole chain from some dude working in Russia through his paymasters to the infection to the victim. But that almost never happens. Last time I found that perfect chain where you could humanize the victims and explain what was happening the day they got hit. And the guy I wrote a book about it. So that was Fatal System Error. It is super rare. I'm agnostic about which pieces of the puzzle I use to write a good story that will bring attention to important policy stuff that we have to figure out. Except that I try not to. I don't want to heroize the bad guys, and I also don't find most of them very interesting. I find the good guys more interesting, and generally the victims, they didn't do anything hideously wrong, and wrong place, wrong time, and so I tend not to spotlight them either. So I guess if I was going to, more often than not, I am focusing on the investigation. And talking about highlighting policy issues in play when relevant.
Awesome. What was your favorite cybercrime story that you've covered so far in your career?
So this is going to be a bit out of left field, I guess, but it is. I promise it's really fun. So I had read about. If you remember Jared Fogle, his situation, he got...
For those who don't remember.
Okay, so he was a former Subway spokesperson turned child predator. So his situation, part of the bus, they had these dogs sniff out this hidden hard drive that he had, which I thought was kind of insane. And then I found out that there was a canine training academy 2 hours away from where I work. So I went to this academy and I followed around this dog training procedure that they have for dogs to sniff out electronics specifically, which is pretty cool. I got to spend the whole day with a bunch of dogs, and it's cybercrime adjacent. So
wow, that rules.
It's great.
Mine isn't fun at all. Okay. I was just going to say we had been talking about this question, and I think favorite is maybe not the word I would use, because these stories, it's hard to think of one. Maybe you were saying, one where you have the whole chain and you can make it into an amazing narrative in a book would be a favorite. But typically these are stories that are really painful to report, or really sucks to see the toll and just see the sort of moral bankruptcy of the actors. And but I was just going to say that in general, the storyline that I feel strongly about covering is business email compromise, where actors, sometimes through email compromise, but sometimes essentially just through extended phishing and social engineering attacks, trick companies into sending money to pay a contractor that doesn't really exist, or put someone on their payroll who doesn't exist, or something like that. And this is the biggest type of cybercrime in terms of losses, at least according to the complaints that the FBI gets. but it just doesn't get a lot of coverage for, I think, the general audience, because it's that's kind of it. Like, that's what happens, and none of the companies ever want to talk about it. And I think the sort of numbers that are reported to the FBI are way, way under, because companies don't even want to talk about it with law enforcement or anyone. But it's huge, and the same concepts are used or it's sort of enmeshed with other types of crime, like romance scams, and now pig butchering, which is same type of thing, where you're like, it's sort of bringing someone into this web that is totally fictionalized, where they think they're corresponding with a different person than they really are, and end up sending all their money. And these are all kind of on a continuum. So anyway, business email compromise is, I guess, a favorite.
I like crimes that illustrate a new thing or an important systemic problem. Fatal system error was super useful for me, in part because the crimes themselves were dumb. It was just DDoS, and it was extortion behind the DDoS. And it's maybe really boring technologically, but the beauty part is my grandmother can understand, we're going to knock over your business until you pay us money, which is what they were doing. The great thing about fatal system error is that the first people that were doing DDoS for hire or DDoS for money were going after offshore gambling companies serving US bettors. And that's sort of a weird, why would you attack another mob? Well, it's because their infrastructure was in Costa Rica or wherever, not terrifically deep. It's because there's no heckin' way they're going to the FBI for help. And it's because if they're down on Super Bowl Sunday, they are completely screwed. Also, they have a ton of cash on hand. So I was able to tell the story of basically mob versus mob, and one guy who sort of accidentally infiltrated the American, like Gambino mobsters after protecting them, and then deliberately infiltrated the Russian mob, and wound up with names of 3 real people who eventually got sent to jail in Russia. And the point of the story wasn't like, kumbaya, we can all do this together and get Russian baddies. It's the outrageous effort it took, including like the British Foreign Secretary, attempts on the British detective's life in Russia, all this stuff to get 3 basically mid-level people before the Russian government said, okay, you can stop investigating now rather than go upstream. Thank you very much, time to go. So it was a terrific window on everything. And then just because that's a heavy one, I'll tell you, in a way, like a perfect encapsulation of a similar era was the theft of sex.com. It was registered by Gary Kremen when it was free to register at Network Solutions. It just seemed like it might be a good idea to have sometime. And then Network Solutions was like run by 5 people and a monkey, and this small-time hustler from jail forged Gary's signature on a letter to Network Solutions and wound up with the domain. It was raking in millions and millions of dollars and living it high off the hog in Mexico, and basically getting away with it. And to me, he's the real hero of the story, because if there anything encapsulates the .com smash and grab era, that's it.
So have any of you been approached by somebody who's claiming to be responsible for an attack or some kind of incident? I'm curious, for those of you who have, how do you verify them as sources, and does the fact that they are potential criminals impact the way that you interpret the information that they give you?
That's actually never happened to me, so I'm going to pass it over.
First, I just want to say, you said you weren't going to glorify the actors.
But that's 1999 in a nutshell. Yeah,
so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this too, but I definitely have corresponded with entities, claiming to be the actor behind particularly data breaches, and sometimes like ransomware gangs and stuff often have like a PR account or sort of a public-facing account, on criminal forums where they're like available to talk. So that was something that I was just going to say about this, is that I have done those types of correspondences, but I never really felt like I was the only one they were talking to. It always just kind of feels like, yeah, they're probably talking to a bunch of researchers or researchers who are sort of posing as being members of that cybercriminal community, and then they're trying to like get the word out probably with other reporters as well. And so, yeah, I have had those situations, but I haven't really had the experience of being like, oh shit, like this person's only talking to me and they're claiming that they did, you know what I mean? So, but I don't know, have you had other experiences?
Yeah, so there are other reporters that do it more than I do. I don't make a big habit out of it, in part because, in part it's a matter of vetting, but the real part is I don't want to, there are many cases where they want publicity. Right. They're publishing confidential information and they want everyone to see that confidential information, and that's why you go to the media, because that puts the most pressure on the company. And I don't want to be a part of that. I don't have there's no hard and fast rule, but I have kind of personally a sliding scale. And the least likely I am, if it's like a nation state activity and they're trying to hurt, government X by leaking stuff, my bar is super high. I want to see, clear public benefit from publishing the information. So I didn't do much rummaging in the Sony hack because there was some mild racism and there's some other corruption things, but I didn't want to help out North Korea. Whistleblower, I'm most likely to publish something. Criminal group is in the middle. But I haven't done a lot of chatting with them. I guess one of my more memorable ones is I did chat with Gutierrez too, and he was saying, hey, I can get you, stuff on this, stuff on that, and the FBI has already read this, so I'm not really reviewing very much. And I chatted to him a while and looked at what was available and decided it wasn't worth it to me, and so I passed. And I later interviewed FBI people who were like, yeah, I read that, and that was good that you did that. Not everybody did best.
Well, if they reach out to you on Jabber, they must be legit.
Say what?
If they reach out to you on Jabber, they must be legit.
I feel like all of this happens on Jabber.
That's why I never got anything.
It's always funny to me when I see stories where it's like somebody said this on Pastebin, and I was like, okay, I get that the company statement may not be the most credible source of information, but why is that less credible than what people are saying actually on these forums?
Well, so to me, a much more common case for me is a security researcher who's gone a little bit too far maybe, and gotten into some stuff, saw some bad things, but shouldn't have been there in the first place. And so they're trying to launder legitimate information about a vuln or exposure through me, and that I'm, often willing to play ball on, depending. And sometimes I know those researchers' names and protect them, and sometimes I don't even know who they are. I just have to verify the information somewhere else.
What's the standard for you for reporting on the contents of emails or data or information that that you receive through a leak or an attack of some kind? There's a lot of conversation, I think, between security practitioners and journalists, unfortunately, on Twitter, where it's not productive. But just how do you decide, because some of this information is sensitive and some of it ends up being personal, some of it ends up being identifiable for specific individuals. How do you decide the contents that you will or won't publish?
I think part of it comes down to newsworthiness, and a lot of it, the sensitive information that you're talking about, I really don't find that as newsworthy. I think if the person involved in it wants this information out there, then that's a little bit different. Sometimes when I report on a warrant or something like that, I will reach out to the person involved in the warrant. And if they're saying no, I want this out, I want people to know that I've been sent a warrant by, Google didn't send them the warrant, but they sent the warrant to Google, and then Google sends them the alert. Then I will if they want the information out there, and I think it's important to show this is a real person that this is affecting. Then yeah, I think part of it is consent, and then the other part is very much newsworthiness. And I think personal information a lot of times is just not doesn't rise to that level for me.
You go. I'm thinking.
I feel like I already answered it. Sliding
Yeah.
scale. You're weighing public benefit versus what's the probable motive, who's the probable actor, and how much are you helping them by doing this. But there's almost no reason to publish anybody's private information, unless it's a U.S. senator like trying to do business, with a foreign government or something.
Yeah. Well, I remember, Joe, you were the one that mentioned in our conversations as we were preparing for this the possibility that like somebody may be trying to get you to publish something as a way to blackmail someone or another company. And so I think being astute and sensitive to what is this person's motive.
I'm in a position of luxury in many ways, and one of them is I'm not paid per click, and I'm not desperate for traffic, and so if I don't want to help somebody out, I don't have to. And I think there are other more desperate publications and journalists who really need, in order to feed their families, need to get some of that stuff out there, and I'm glad I don't have to do that.
Well, and I was thinking about how, like, one thing that's interesting is we all sometimes end up, like security beat reporters, sometimes end up playing like a sort of gatekeeper role within the newsroom, because if the leaked information is coming through us or coming to us, like the stories that are on our beat might be not about the information itself or what it contains, but about what happened, like what's the incident or who's the actor or what's the situation. That's like what's relevant to our beat. But if there's something in the material that's like potentially newsworthy on a different beat, I mean, I completely agree, like personal information of sort of like private citizens without public significance, like that should never be reported on, there's no reason. But if there's something that's potentially going to affect or sort of be interesting to colleagues on another beat or something like that, I think that's where some of our expertise needs to come in of, like you're saying, attempting to kind of apply a sliding scale, because we all have just kind of thought about this stuff a bit more than people on other beats, and just trying to, I don't know, I feel some amount of responsibility to like help triage that, rather than being like, I don't know, someone sent me this weird thing, I'm only covering this part, you do whatever, and like thinking about what you're saying, Melanie, about the potential motivations of how this came to be.
So I was just going to say Hunter Biden's laptop is a really interesting case study, because there you have insane competitive media pressure, and you're always going to be accused of everything by all sides, you're suppressing the story or whatever, but it was hinky the way it came to light. And what we eventually did at the Washington Post months later is we had some top security experts verify part of the stuff as having been legit email, but most of the contents laptop they could not verify, and so we didn't get into it. We didn't report it.
I think it's also just like a matter of discretion too. So around the time of Elon dumpster fire, there were a lot of people were reporting on the attorney's like message on Slack, like saying, hey, if you want to talk to a whistleblower, here's like the contact information. I'm pretty sure I hadn't seen any outlet like publish that attorney's like name, but the like people who did report on it, like I mean I had seen the name, but like I also made the conscious decision, like, well, that's not really relevant to the article. Like the point of it is that people at Twitter are concerned. So yeah, I mean, I'm glad that every other reporter had reached the same conclusion.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of something that I think is important for us to know, is that you're all like print journalists.
Or like words journalists?
Text.
Well, text words.
Yeah.
Typed words. Whereas, particularly, and I'll stick to the United States so I don't end up sticking my foot in my mouth, but the media landscape in the United States varies depending on the medium that we're talking about. So print journalists in general tend to be less politically polarizing on those types of stories compared to, say, like our broadcast media, where there are certain outlets that really are specifically leaning intentionally on both sides. And so, it's for me, it's always interesting to see how different types of outlets cover the same story. And it just, at least in my experience, the print journalists tend to be less political and less polarizing in the way that they report it. And so I just wanted to note that for the folks here, because this level-headedness that you're hearing right now does not exist in all newsrooms. And so I want to ask whether or not you think there's something that those of us in this room may not know about, cybercrime journalism.
I actually think that covering cybercrime is not all that different from covering like just crime in general. So before I was even like a tech reporter, I covered the NYPD pretty extensively. And a lot of those skills like really translated over to covering like cybercrime. A lot of it was like understanding how to read court documents and police statements and things like that. And that really helped out with a lot of the DOJ like pressers that they do when they do like these like big busts, because they usually release like their affidavit along with it. And it's like I feel like I've developed like some pretty good skills of just like reading through them like very quickly and understanding what like the key parts were. So if you understand how to do crime reporting, I think it translates very easily into like cybercrime reporting.
I'm calling it cybercrime because I think there's people in the back playing a drinking game. But yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, I'm trying to think what like might be surprising about it. I don't know, maybe just the thing we've been talking about, that there are so many stakeholders and sort of sorry, I hate that word, like stakeholders, but that there's so many.
I think you mean cyber stakeholders.
Oh, thank you. Okay, drink. There's just so many sort of interests involved in these situations. I guess I hadn't really thought about it, but it is sort of a specific reporting challenge, or just sort of sub-discipline to like manage, because you're trying to, it's like victims are like often trying to cover up or obfuscate what happened, especially if they feel like the way that, and there's this sort of victim shaming that is really problematic, but sometimes it's like, well, why was that organization like so poorly protected, or why was that why hadn't that government agency implemented like the cybersecurity improvements that were mandated 10 years ago.
That they wrote.
Right, that they wrote, exactly. So, it's like there is this very complicated interplay to try to get to just a story that is straightforward and digestible and in plain language. And one other thing I was going to say, when I called it words journalism, and everyone laughed because like everything's words, it makes sense, I get that. But I call it that because it's like that different mediums have a different amount of like composition time, like like news that is like network news that's like a conversation or something. People are like speaking extemporaneously in real time. It's different from the medium being that people are going to read or like hear the words that you composed, like that. They're just different mediums, and you put together stories in different ways, depending. And there is like an intentionality, and there's a friction to composing words that then people are gonna read or hear back, that can be helpful for thoughtfulness on these things.
Can you imagine if every white paper had to have like a video component with it as well?
Yeah.
Well, they've already done branding, since Heartbleed. I guess that was the first one.
It's not a real phone unless it has a logo.
Right.
So, I think security is an incredibly important thing. I've been covering security for 23 years now, and I'm going to keep on covering it. And I think of cybercrime as a subset of that. The reason I think it's fascinating is that it's interdisciplinary. It's like a criminal justice story and a geopolitical story and a market failure story and a market capture story. There's lots of different things going on that you don't get to by writing most tech stuff. Security is really at the heart of it, but you're going to get more readers when there's somebody's knocking over a hospital than you do when you talk about bad patch management practices. So I think it's useful in that way, but it's I don't care about a specific crime. I care about why we haven't really done very much about ransomware. Like why are we as a government, as a society, unable to get our act together and beat this? And so crime is a way to talk about those things to me.
And I want to build on that a bit, Joe, and ask, what is the difference? I mean, I know a lot of reporters who, once they have an idea for a story, they then have to go pitch an editor, right? So each individual reporter may not actually get to choose exactly which story or which angle they go with. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, what is the process for choosing to focus on something, that's more systemic like that, of why have we not figured out ransomware, versus, like covering those spot crimes, like you said. Like, is there a different process for the journalist and how you formulate that story and how you get buy-in, from the editorial folks?
I think we're expected to do both. Like you are expected to do like this spot news coverage, like day-to-day things. But I think when you're steeped in all of this, like all the time, you do start to notice patterns. You do start to notice trends, and then that's kind of when I bring it up with my editor. Of I keep hearing this. I keep hearing about it. Let's like dig deeper into this and give it more of a focus. Like as you said, like with ransomware, for example. Yeah, we were writing about these like spot ransomware attacks. Obviously, like I don't think WannaCry was a spot news kind of story, but then it became, the city of like Atlanta has been hit by it, and some other city gets hit, and then you notice, oh, a lot of these like cities are being targeted now. And what are they doing about it? They all have like different responses and things like that. And then I think all of those questions just naturally like coalesce into like its own story. My editors have always been pretty receptive of that. So it has not been an uphill battle for me to get them on board with these kinds of stories.
I'm curious what you think. I'm just like watching this panel too.
It's changed depending on where I was working at the time. So the Post, fortunately, has like a high bar. They care about the most impactful, biggest things. So Colonial Pipeline, you're going to write. WannaCry, you're going to write. And then maybe you'll come back with an explainer analysis or something in a little bit, or maybe you'll get a cool investigative piece down the road. But the breach of the day is not their thing, which is great. I don't want to write the breach of the day. And I'll read all the cool like vuln research, but it's unless I see what I think is an important pattern and something that's really novel, and has wider impact, I'm not going to do that. So there are many stories from the before times when nobody was covering this and editors didn't understand it, where it was really bleak. And like the one that comes to my mind is when I was working for the Financial Times, which is an august publication, but very top down and in a really bad time zone for me. And I got woken up, as I often did, at like 5:30 or 6 in the morning by some guy in London saying, look, the editor-in-chief, hackers have broken into the CIA, and we want it on page, the editor-in-chief wants it on page 1 in 2 hours. And I'm out of a cold sleep, and so it takes me 5 minutes to find out it's a DDoS on their public-facing website, and anybody could do that. And then they're like, and I tried to explain it, and they got mad at me. I'm contradicting
like 90
the
minutes.
editor-in-chief. Yeah, I'm contradicting the editor-in-chief, and I'm like trying to get out of work, and so like there I had this desperate struggle to come up with some story that is true and is interesting enough to get them off my backs and keep this off of page 1. And it was a frustrating process. And I think as a whole, the journalism on this stuff has gotten so much better than it used to be.
Yeah. The one thing I would add is like that maybe also ties into things people don't know or something, but a lot of people probably know this in this room, is just like, the main thing we contend with is like the difference between a topic and a story. You can't just like do a report on a topic. So even if you're like, okay, this, I have seen this pattern in ransomware stuff, and I sort of have this thesis about it. Like, it needs to be reported and it needs to be timely or have sort of a new element in some way. So Wired is also very supportive about kind of doing both types of stories, like the news coverage and the more stepped back news analysis type thing. But that is just an important like baseline quality issue with journalism, you know, when you're pitching, is like, it can't just be because something is like abstractly interesting. It needs to be grounded.
Awesome. Well, I could continue this with the three of you all day long. Thank you so much for participating and sharing your expertise with us today. Can we give a round of applause to our panelists?